hopefully everyone is enjoying the reflections of the works of writers Paul Marshall and John A. Williams. So we don't need to remind you about the power of literature and what it has provided for our emotional, intellectual, and spiritual well-being. So literature has been an anchor, and it has provided a sense of understanding for many of us during some of history's darkest hours. And once again, we are facing dark yet hopeful times. Our scholars today, Dr. Lawrence Jackson and Dr. Mary Helen Washington, will discuss the importance and the value of the work of Paul Marshall and John A. Williams in today's social and political climate. Dr. Keith Gilyard will moderate the panel. Just to give you an introduction to our moderator, Dr. Keith Gilyard is the author or editor of 25 books, including True to the Language Game, African American Discourses, Cultural Politics and Pedagogy, and John Oliver Killens, A Life of Black Literary Activism. He is a two-time recipient of an American Book Award and served on the faculties of Medgar College, CUNY, where he helped to launch the National Black Writers Conference and Syracuse University. He is currently the Edwin Earl Sparks Professor of English and African American Studies at Penn State. And I will now turn the program over to Dr. Keith Gilyard.
Thank you, Donna. Welcome to this session. We Cried I Am, featuring Lawrence P. Jackson and Mary Helen Washington. Is there, okay. I'm seeing funny messages. Okay, so I want to welcome Lawrence, or Larry, as I always say, and I want to introduce both him and Mary Helen. So I'll read it to make sure I give them their propers. Dr. Lawrence P. Jackson is the author of the award-winning books Chester B. Himes, A Biography, published by W.W. Norton in 2017, The Indignant Generation, A Narrative History of African-American Writers and Critics, published by Princeton, 2010, and My Father's Name, A Black Virginia Family After the Civil War, published by University of Chicago Press, 2012, and Ralph Ellison's Emergence of Genius, 1913 to 1952, published by Wiley in 2002. And I was always happy about that book because Larry got the birth date of Ellison right. And I always tell people about the birth date, which is a year earlier than you see in most textbooks. But I noticed that most textbooks haven't changed since 2002. So that's strange to me, but go to Larry's book and get the right date. Harper's Magazine and Best American Essays have published his criticism and nonfiction. Professor Jackson is now Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of English and History at Johns Hopkins University, where he directs the Billie Holiday Project for Liberation Arts. His next book projects are Job's Labyrinth, which will be out from Grey Wolf in 2022, and Clint Eastwood's Lost Cause, Race in the American Western, which will be published by Johns Hopkins University Press. Welcome.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Keith. It's great here to be here today with you and Mary Helen Washington, people who have helped me as I have gone along the way.
I see you have the books on the shelf, so if you get stuck memory-wise, you can just turn around and grab a book.
Look,
and you can just get a quick reference, man. Fantastic, great work up there. Dr. Mary Helen Washington, someone who I've been a fan of for a long time, is a distinguished university professor in the English department at the University of Maryland, College Park, specializing in 20th and 21st century African-American literature. Her monograph, amazing work, The Other Blacklist, The African-American Literary and Cultural Left of the 1950s, published by Columbia University Press in 2014, received the honorable mention in the William Sanders Scarborough Prize competition of the Modern Language Association, or what we otherwise know as MLA. She was president of the American Studies Association from 1996 to 1997, and was awarded the American Study Association's Carl Bode Norman Holmes Pearson Prize for Lifetime Achievement in 2015. Her current project, as some of us know by now, Paule, Like a Man, a biography of Paul Marshall, will be published by Yale University Press in 2022. Welcome, Mary Helen.
Thanks, Keith. Very nice to be here. This has been an outstanding program. I hope it's you've got a tape of it.
I think I see a recording button here, so I'm not sure, but I think it is being recorded. So, and of course, your presence is part of what makes it what it is. So, I'm glad to have you here. I don't want to. I was talking to Larry a couple of minutes ago. I don't want to straitjacket either one of you because you prepped a certain way, and then of course there's expectations that people have for wanting to hear how you connect these writers, John A. Williams and Paul Marshall, to a contemporary world. But I don't want to do that in a straitjacket sense. I just assume that as you get into your presentations and say all the things you want to say, we'll see some obvious resonances to the contemporary world, and we'll let that go from there. But I don't want to I don't want to box you in with respect to what it is you wanted to say and what you're prepared to do. To begin, I'm going to ask in alphabetical order. I'll just do it that way. So I'm going to ask Larry to open up with his reflections and information, and we'll go from there. I'm assuming he'll be talking largely about John A.
I think that what we want to do is we're going to have a conversation, Keith, and we would love for you to participate in that conversation.
I'm gonna get in, but I want you to say your piece.
Yep.
And then we'll go from there.
Yeah, you know, there won't be a problem with that. You know, there always be too much of the piece. As we were talking, we thought it might be fascinating for Mary Helen Washington to get started and to open us up. So I'm actually going to defer to her, and you know, then we'll go from Marshall to John A.
Mary Helen, she was going to take over anyway, right?
I don't want to take over. I do want to get my piece in.
My sister, go ahead.
I think I'm going to start with this little known piece of literary and political history, just because I know nobody knows this, because I've been doing all this work on Paul, so I've uncovered it. And so I have to tell you a little story, and I have to read you a little bit of a speech that she gave in 1964. And then I want to tell you what was so transformative about that speech and its context. So this is 1964, it's June, and they have called together these people, Black writers and Black intellectuals and white liberals and intellectuals, to have this conversation in a forum called The Black Revolution and the White Backlash. And it created all kind of controversy, and people told lies about it and made it seem, you know, more controversial than it actually, well, I guess it was controversial. So anyway, the Black writers on this panel were John Killens, it was Leroy Jones at the time, Lorraine Hansberry, Ruby Dee, and Paul Marshall. And every time people talk about that forum and the speeches, they always go to Lorraine Hansberry. And she only gave a few off-the-cuff remarks, whereas Paul actually prepared a very well thought out analysis of, and a kind of theoretical beginning of Black nationalism. So here I'm just going to read two little excerpts from the speech that she gave at that forum. And I want you to notice how prescient she is, how futuristic this is. So she's given this definition of Black nationalism, and she starts off with, I would like to begin by saying something about the two words which form the poles of our discussion this evening, Black and white, and how in my mind they have become less important as a description of a man's color and more important as the description of an essential heart attitude of mind and heart. White has begun to suggest more and more to me a moral callousness, a timidity, a kind of rigidity and blindness, a childish belief that if you close your eyes tightly, the bad man will disappear. White is wealth without wisdom and an incredible innocence matched only by arrogance. In a word, it is a force in the world today that is opposed to change, even when that change is necessary for survival. Now notice, she's getting right away from this idea of color and race. Okay, then further down on the speech, she begins, at the same time, the word Black has expanded in meaning. It has come to stand for that force that recognizes change, social and political change and movement and struggle that are the essential realities of human existence. Black is the willingness to question and reject the old established institutions once they have proven obsolete and unjust. Black is to seek a new way. The Negro is symbolic of the force for change in America today, and the demand for complete equality is part of the larger demand for human dignity and fundamental freedoms being sounded all over the world. Now, those are just two little excerpts, and you can see that she is really giving us a kind of 21st century almost definition of race and how race matters. Now, the important thing for me, well, one of the important things about this speech is that as she gave this speech, she was looking out into the audience because she wanted to connect with a face in the audience. It was her close friend, Malcolm X. And she said she looked out and she saw his face. So I want to think about this as a moment in which the person that we always think of as the cornerstone of Black nationalism is sitting in the audience learning from this woman, learning about Black nationalism from Paule Marshall. And so it's a moment to me of Black women's leadership. And to connect it back to a lot of Paule's work, almost all of Paule's work, I see it, one of the fundamental important things about her work is how she is always imagining Black female leadership. And that I would almost connect those images, those imaginative fictional images, I would take them to a direct line to Stacey Abrams and to our ability to imagine and accept Black women's leadership in 2021. So that's where I wanted to start. That's sort of a kind of encapsulating some of the things that I think are important about Paule.
Oh, that's great. That's fantastic. It's funny, we have Malcolm. He shows up in a number of those places.
Yes.
He's there. He's down at Howard University at another literature panel. He's in the audience. He's hanging near the back. He's at Hansberry's funeral, hanging in the back. So he was looking for that connection. Yeah. So he was looking for that connection, and Paule Marshall was one of the places that he went for that ground. And Ruby Dee is another who doesn't get talked about enough. They were in conversation with him and were directly influencing him at the time. But I wanted to ask you about your material though, because where did you? Because I've seen pieces or excerpts from the comments at that forum, but you seem to have gotten the totality of the speeches.
I bought the recording.
Oh, you got the recording?
I got the recording of the entire 2-hour forum.
So you better read.
So I went back and I pieced together her whole talk, and I realized she was the only one there that actually did a prepared speech. And yet every time people talk about that forum, they only talk about Lorraine Hansberry.
All right, be quiet,
Mary Helen,
be quiet, because that's one. I'm one of the people that talk about it, and I went straight to Hansberry because I didn't have the whole 2 hours like you. So
is the speech available in her papers?
you know, her papers are at my house. So
Those
her
are the
papers,
papers, right? Yeah.
it's available now because I transcribed the speech.
Oh,
Wow.
got you.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I committed the novice mistake. I just went to Hansberry and that was it. So I look forward to reading more about that. I think that's
It's a
great.
fabulous speech.
Yeah, fantastic.
And you know, one of the other things that she says in this speech, she uses a line from Malcolm X, but she changes it. She says, we have to use everything we can, every means we can to liberation that are effective.
Right. You know what about that line is that line circulated among that whole crowd, because from what I'm able to understand, they said that a lot inside the Harlem Writers Guild. And so Paul Marshall said a variation of it. John Killens said a variation of it. John Henry Clark said a variation of it. And it might be the case that Malcolm got it from them. When he finally said by every means necessary, he got something that they have been circulating for a couple of years.
Yeah. Okay.
And when you look at, because you see it in the Organization of African American Unity, his founding document, we know that that founding document that was attributed to Malcolm X, authorship-wise, we know that it was written by John Oliver Killens and John Henry Clark. So he wasn't, they were professional writers. They weren't quoting Malcolm. He was quoting them.
Well,
so,
you know, Paul and Malcolm had a close friendship. She said that he would call her in the middle of the night when he was not able to sleep and talk and ask her for advice and, you know, also helped her. And he was at her house for a New Year's Eve party, the New Year's Eve before he was killed. And she says he sat the entire evening with his back up against the wall.
Wow. Yeah, I would
Did they have a connection because of the West Indian background at all?
I'm not sure that's what it was. I think that they were in political circles and actually social circles, which is interesting because she invited both Betty Shabazz and Malcolm to this New Year's Eve party. So she was friends with the whole family.
Right. I think the whole Harlem Writers Guild had sort of adopted Malcolm. They would have meetings at Juanita Portier's house. And stuff like that. And so Ruby would be there, Ossie would be there, Malcolm would come out. I think Harry Belafonte might have been at one or two of them. And so that crowd is more connected than a lot of people realize. And,
that's a whole story.
Paul Marshall's in the center of it, without a doubt. Yeah.
So that's my opening piece.
Okay. And we'll hear more from you for sure.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Well, I was thinking about John Williams, and I suppose that perhaps, you know, in a lot of ways, he will be unfamiliar to a contemporary audience, perhaps with the exception of the, you know, what maybe has come to be represented as his most important work, The Man Who Cried I Am. But Williams was, of course, a naturalist, a realist writer, and starts writing in the late 1950s, had been working in publishing circles after completing college and after, you know, being honorably discharged from the Navy. And he really, you know, in his earliest works, you know, and throughout his career is definitely taking on sort of the burden of racism in American society. But what's fascinating to me, and you know, might be interesting for us, is that often the social world that he's recreating is one of the African American middle class. And so, in a novel that you know, I think we should probably be dealing with a little bit more, maybe than we do, is Sissy, which comes out in 1963. And Chester Himes, who was Williams' friend, thought that this novel was going to be, you know, sort of the tour de force about the African-American family. And you have Williams really trying to show the development of Black artists working up from the African-American working class, going overseas, becoming established, you know, sort of, if you can imagine perhaps the better known work of James Baldwin in Another Country, imagine Ida and Rufus, the brother and sister, as successful artists who've, created families or gone through divorces and then coming back to understand about their parents' struggles at a later time. And so it's sort of a fascinating account of the Black migration, the movement from Mississippi to the north and then over to Los Angeles, and what happens to the children and the sacrifices that are made, the tragedy of so much of Black life during the 40s and the 50s. I mean, again, the incredible sacrifice their parents are making, and then the way that love has a circuitous path through a family structure, and one that offers the opportunity for some freedoms and joys, but in other ways also causes a great deal of pain and sacrifice. And so I was going to read a passage that in some ways it's like the unraveling of this novel, Sissy. And I have this is the jacket from the copy, just so that you can see that, sort of an interesting kind of avant-garde design. And then the picture of Williams on the back, trying to make sure I got everything lined up. But Williams wanted to have this, this novel with the mother at the center, this woman who has gone through the Great Migration and who has, sort of three really consequential relationships with the father of the children, with the man that she was, maybe more genuinely in love with and inspired by, and then the man who she is with, sort of on her deathbed. But this is the account of sort of arriving in the North, the train that's taking her away from the fields of poverty and to the, sort of the aspirations for, a new kind of life, a new kind of opportunity and mobility. And it brings, of course, the chance for love. So this is the story that she wants to tell her daughter, and that she sort of stirs herself from her dying bed to be able to, just sort of repair the relationship with the daughter who believes that she's been terribly treated by the mother. So this is in some ways the narrative that brings them together, this memory. The long dingy train had the Jim Crow car fastened to the coal tender. Coal dust had swirled continuously through the car. Bags, old papers, chicken bones, and crusts of bread had gathered in the corners. The once plush-covered seats had been filthy. It had been stiflingly, inhumanely hot, but Arthur had come through with sandwiches and coffee and cold water for the old people. She had liked Arthur from the very first. At Cincinnati, he had said, "When the train clears the station, you can sit anywhere you want, young lady," though he wasn't much older than she, "and even going to the diner and get yourself some good hot food." He was in college, he told her, sitting down beside her after they left Buffalo. He was working for the summer. The city she was going to, he said, was one of the more progressive ones in the North. It had a tradition, had been one of the main stations along the Underground Railroad. While she spoke, she thought how smart he was and how much smarter he would be when he finished college. He was from North Carolina. He sometimes stayed 2 or 3 days in the city waiting for his train after he had time off. I got to be pretty crazy about him, she had planned to say to Iris, and how that man could kiss. You know how it is when you're young. And Arthur went away and Big Ralph started to come around. Oh, you know your father. He was a singing man and kind of big in that raggedy town. Here I was, a little old country girl with Arthur gone. Big Ralph promised me the moon and I believed him. Tell you I was young. Well, that moon was so far away, girl. And one thing and another. Arthur was back the next summer, coming and going. Me and your father had been done married and had lost Juanita. Your brother, Ralph, didn't know nothing ever happened to him. Iris, that whole town was poor. We went hungry plenty of times. Juanita started to die when we didn't have money to buy coal to keep the house warm. I got mad. I just got mad. Used to sit home all the time when I was sick. I was sick a lot of time with them babies. And if I wasn't sick, I was out there working because we had to get some money into that house some way. Me and little Ralph sitting home sick. Girl, I was mad. The only time I wasn't mad was when Arthur was around. I couldn't be mad when he was around. Would Iris smile and understand? Yes, I slipped out to see him. I'm talking woman to woman now. I know you haven't been no virgin since you and Harry broke up, have you? Here she had planned to reach over and touch her daughter's knee to give it a conspiratorial push. I know you understand, don't you, honey? I'm not proud. No, I'm not. I got to make my peace with God. I'd leave little Ralph with old Miss Clark and run to see Arthur. I'd generally get home before Big Ralph got home from the Silver Dollar. So the daughter Iris has taken on her father, Big Ralph, who was like he's a nightclub singer, a humble nightclub singer, and she's taken the sound and gone international with it and been incredibly successful. But the mother always had this secret that she needed to share because the daughter had been, again, in a very tumultuous relationship, feeling like she had not been loved like the other children and that she didn't share the same paternity. And so Williams was trying to give us a certain kind of agony of a Black striving family and the achievement of the children in the North, but at what cost? And at the same time, you get the very rich detail of the social conditions that Black people had to endure as they are making this trek in the 1920s and the 1930s. And so this would have been, really one of our earliest treatments. We often talk about Chester Himes' novel, The Third Generation, but one of the earliest treatments of the Black family and the Great Migration. And so you have Williams and Paule Marshall really around the same moment, 1959, 1963, writing about Black family struggles in the North as a part of the Great Migration, and then also the achievement and the special sensibility of the next generation.
Okay, let me piggyback on that as a kind of counterpoint to what you're saying about the middle class, because Paule Marshall's subject is the Black middle class almost always. Of course, her characters, at least in Brown Girl Brownstone, are both Barbadian. They're Barbadian American, and so there's a little difference in their experience. They don't come on the Great Migration; they come from migration abroad. But her subject is the middle class, as John A. Williams. In fact, Williams says specifically he wanted to write about the Black middle class. When Paul writes about the Black middle class, what comes up, though, always are issues of gender. So in Brown Girl Brownstones, the young woman is a college student toward the end of the novel, and she's having an affair with an artist. Not a successful artist, but a young man who's a little older than she is, an artist. And what's so interesting about this affair is how Paule Marshall describes the girl's reaction to this affair. Okay, so let me read you a little bit from Selena, the main character in Brown Girl Brownstones, coming home from college, on her way home to eat, and then planning to go back to her boyfriend's house, Clive. Okay, I want you to pay really close attention to the way this is narrated, because there's nothing else like this in literature at 1959. She's coming up from the subway stairs onto Fulton Street. She sees the sun in the background. A sinuous breeze has wound around her bare legs, and laughing, she gave a small joyous leap, her body still fluid and toned from the long afternoon rehearsal with the dance group. She was on her way home to eat before going to Clive's, and she moved swiftly through the crowd. A slender, dark girl with supple legs, a strong, graceful lift to her head and back, and an almost irrepressible vitality in her stride. In each cutting swing of her arms, she might at any moment, it seemed, burst into a wild spin or execute another exuberant leap there on the street. Now, the way I read this, if I had read something like this when I was 19 years old, it would have saved me a lot of heartache. She's having an affair with this man, a clandestine affair that she's hiding from her mother. She's going to college. She's becoming a star in the dance group and having this affair with Clive. She is not seduced and abandoned. She is not worried. The affair has created a vitality and exuberance in her life. Sex is almost never described this way for a 19-year-old girl. She's supposed to be suffering. She's supposed to be worried about getting pregnant. She's supposed to be having a back alley abortion. And instead she's leaping in the street with this exuberance over all the things that are, vital in her life. So I just want to say that that's the way that's one of the aspects of the way Marshall portrays this middle class existence. And yet, of course, there's pain. Her mother does domestic work, and there's that generation is still dealing with a lot of social issues.
Well, Shuggie Skeet is my favorite character from Brown Girl Brownstones.
Okay, and again, that brings up the whole issue of sexuality. And in this case, same-sex sexuality, because the description of Shuggie and Selena is a highly sensual, highly erotic encounter. And I would say every single piece of fiction that Paule wrote, with maybe one exception, has some kind of same gender eroticism.
And also, moments of initiation, and the older woman, Shuggie Skeet, who was the boarder in the house,
yes,
bringing along the young girl, Selena, so that she too will one day understand the pleasures and joys of, sexuality. I mean, it's also a sisterly component and initiation dimension to the relationship.
And the sexuality is about pleasure. She conveys that, the desire for pleasure and the acceptance of pleasure and sexuality.
Right.
And again, I think it has to do with Marshall focusing on, a class of people that is not, that is somewhat affluent, not affluent, who has, reached a level of social and economic stability where she can have that experience.
Sure.
I wanted to ask you, Larry, when you were talking about Sissy, because I know this morning Mary Helen had made a point that she saw like heavy traces of Chester Himes in the early attempts of John A. Williams to write fiction, particularly in his first novel, that she saw like Himes is sitting there on the shoulder, and I'm wondering about your take on that.
Like in the Angry Ones.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the one I was.
Yeah. Specifically, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I would think that it's maybe, I don't want to use the term refined, but I would think that the distinctiveness, this is coming from the biographical perspective, right? I do think that, environment and the early experiences are going to be so profound that Chester, being raised in Mississippi and Arkansas, and the long stretch in the Ohio State Penitentiary would definitely give him a particular kind of assertiveness, and I would also say a rawness to his artistic form. And that Williams is, he also has, a certain kind of, I would like to read a little bit about some of the power, because again, I think that people just wouldn't know some of Williams' early work. But I think that it's very much harnessed and refined, and Williams is like a puncher who is smooth and maybe disguises the punch and wants to make sure that you're unwary. Whereas, Chester seems to me like the person who comes out, he's swinging from the opening bell, or maybe that's the way I would sort of distinguish them. But Williams, of course, writing with the anguish about this early career in publishing and the way that all of the doors are blocked. I mean, I think the most poignant scene for me from that novel is, of course, trying to get a cab. And as he sort of lays down the template for us, in this sort of struggle, this agon of the urban African-American, who has money in their pocket. And this is precisely what, we all hoped and prayed that, 64 public accommodations would provide. And of course, this is the world of the 1950s and the 1960s. But I would see, maybe a little bit of a distinction that way. And then, of course, John was wise enough. We've talked about people's foresight and vision to sort of incorporate, I think, Chester as a character and as a point of view in the novel of The Man Who Cried I Am. And I think that that was maybe, I think that it was Chester didn't write so many John Williams into his work.
Right. And there's a few other people in there too that are written in there that we can recognize.
There we go.
Yeah. Yeah, we were talking about that book this morning also, particularly the last chapter of talking about The Man Who Cried I Am, and with so many people talking about the King Alfred plan. And I was mentioning that, you know, I was from a generation where people all around me were thinking this was real, like this was a textbook or something that had been published, and they didn't note when they talked about it, they didn't note that it was a work of fiction. So it was that's the thing, people, even if they don't know the rest of the novel, they know it most from that last chapter, which he gave the plan his name, right? King Alfred. Right? So people didn't catch that.
I wonder if I could maybe just indulge you just to read the 2 paragraphs, because this was the fascinating thing about Williams and his point of view. He's in a conversation with his friend Chester Himes very early, where they're talking about the surveillance from different security agencies. And of course, Chester was in France, where he was being surveilled by the Organisation Armée Sécurité. And this, of course, would be something that people like Marine Le Pen, that she's coming out of. I mean, a politician who's active today, right? This would be an organization familiar with her. They attempt to assassinate the president of France, Charles de Gaulle, but they were certainly following Chester because he was opposing them. And in the United States, John Williams started to focus on the way that different Black Americans, Malcolm X, obviously, also James Baldwin, Martin Luther King, obviously, were being kept track of by American intelligence services. And for Williams, maybe in a particularly robust way, I mean, this was grist for the creative mill. However, these accounts weren't verified for the American public until the Church Commission in 1975. Some things started to come out in the newspaper in 1968, but I think this is something we already maybe touched on. This was relative to funding for things like the American Society of
African culture.
making the AMSAC Society, yes, sir. The African Society, you know, where you had African American scholars making connections with people, collegians and leaders throughout sub-Saharan Africa. And, you know, it's sort of a remarkable account that Williams is justly famous for. It's worthwhile to remember that at one point they are postering subway trains in New York with the King Alfred plan as a promotion for the novel. But he writes, you know, this conspiratorial information, you know, at the conclusion of the novel, again, the unraveling of this one, the Black Richard Wright character has been just assassinated and is giving the news to a character that is very much like a Chester Himes, who's traveling in Europe. And he says, you know, God, Max, what doesn't start with Africa? What a history still to be told. This is the Harry Ames, Richard Wright character. This leaving on, again, another deathbed notice. This is maybe a trope that Williams enjoyed. The scientists are starting to say life began there. I'm no scientist, I don't know, but I do know that this letter you're reading had its origins with what happened there. Let me go back to the beginning. I doubt if you've heard of Alliance Blanc. In 1958, Guinea voted to leave the French family of nations, and it once formed a federation with Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, whichever you prefer. The British and French were shaken. How could the country's only 2 minutes ago colonies spring to such political maturity? Would the new federations use pounds or francs? The national banks of both countries were heavily underwriting the banking systems. There would be a temporary devaluation of pounds and francs, whether the new federation minted new money or not. More important, and this is what really rocked Europe, if the federation worked, how many new independent African states would follow suit? Then what would happen to European interests in Africa after independence and federation? And so it's this cold calculus that leads to a plan for genocide for Black Americans, right? and it's a rollicking spy thriller in the Robert Ludlum, what will become the Robert Ludlum tradition, or the author Ian Fleming, sort of dimension of the plot. But nonetheless, you have really an articulate analysis by the end of the 1960s about the machinations of this new world and the danger of African independence, Black self-determination, and Black power at home. So Williams was, he was quite a controversial and provocative writer, but someone whose generation of a conspiracy theory continues to give us, sort of things to think about and to keep current on.
Well, Paul was not aware specifically of being followed and being under surveillance by the FBI until 1965. And that's when Langston Hughes invited her to go on a State Department tour to Europe. I think it was to the UK and France and was a Scandinavian country. It might have been Sweden. But in any case, she accepted. She was all excited about going. And then she got a letter from the State Department asking her to come in for a, quote, briefing. And she writes about this at the beginning of Triangular Road. Well, that's not exactly the, but I'll talk about this, this image. This is Paul getting on an airplane in Rio. She's on her way from Rio to Trinidad. She's been sent there to give this, to write an article about Brazil. Now, this is when Paul is only she's about 26 years old, and she has, been flying all over the Caribbean and South America for this magazine that she worked for. This is 1955. So early on, she had a real sense of what was going on in the world, and she writes about Brazil and the race problems in Brazil with real understanding, even though she's, very young. Okay, then in 1965, when she gets this invitation to go with Langston Hughes on the State Department tour, she gets called in, and she writes about this in Triangular Road. And she says she was dumbstruck, when she got this, because she didn't realize she had a file. And she writes that, well, the government officer conducting the briefing turned out to be a rather matronly looking woman with blonde hair, blue-gray eyes, and the cultivated neutral manner of a civil servant long on the job. Framed on either side of her desk by LBJ's official portrait and the flag on its eagle crown standard, she began the session by placing her hand lightly on my dossier and saying, "Seems you've been fairly active." Okay, so the woman does not actually make any reference to what's in the dossier. She just very surreptitiously lets Paul know that they have something on her. And it's a way of warning her about what she might say when she's in Europe, and to be careful about what she says. Now, Paul doesn't tell you anything else in this memoir about what happened, but I looked up the archives at the University of Arkansas, the State Department tour archives, and I found a document that says that she and William Melvin Kelly, because he was there on the tour, that they were so critical of the United States that they said we would have to conduct a mopping up exercise to clear, the ground for the United States. So she did not hold back at all. She went with the full-blown critique of the United States, and of course was never invited back again. Why she doesn't put that in the memoir is I can't explain, but it's something that I feel as though would have been an important thing to represent how she continued to be a very radical spokesperson and a person who was very much in that kind of Black nationalist vein that you see from 1964. And it also, you know, what she doesn't do is to connect that moment with her leftist politics all through the 1950s. Because here she was in, you know, Marxist groups. The Harlem Writers Guild was full of leftists. She published her first story in a Marxist magazine called Contemporary Reader under the aegis of a communist named Abraham Polonsky. And the person who ran the Harlem Writers Guild before Killens was an open communist named Philip Bonosky. So she, you know, she really got her start as a writer under the tutelage of people who were on the left. And she was very much in activities that were leftist. So there's a through line in her work and in her life of being in a kind of radical position in relationship to the United States.
I thought I might say something about one of the dimensions of Williams' work and the confrontation with police brutality, which also appears very early, or, you know, wanted to make that connection because I did want to also ask Mary Helen if you would talk a little bit about the big question of African survivals that emerges in, especially for the Black Power people or Black Power artists, but then another place of Paul Marshall's leadership. And that's, I would say that's something that, you know, tends to be, could be a little bit different maybe for Williams, maybe in the second half of his career, maybe they come a little bit closer together, but maybe will be somewhat distinguished in the career that he has in the 1950s and early 1960s. But this question of police brutality and radicalism, you know, was certainly a cutting edge issue for Black writers. And, you know, this tendency for the Black middle class to soft pedal the places of strong tension, you know, whether it is the social class arrangement, their position vis-a-vis the nation state, international affairs, the question of African independence, but then, you know, sort of the big issue always at home, what's going on with police brutality. And of course, I think that's also part in Brown Girl Brownstones. But Williams wants to get at this with one of the first novels, the 1961 Night Song, which is a romantic clef of featuring as its protagonist based on Charlie Parker. And this thing about the jazz musician who is, you know, declining because of self-inflicted abuse, but abuse as a form of coping with racism in America culminates when the hero Eagle, called Eagle in the novel, is assaulted by the policeman in a very random encounter near a university. And what's fascinating, I think, to our sensibility would be that this encounter is one that is portrayed as, you know, utterly predictable and imminent. And the nuance that he shows, where with both the series of expectations from the policeman and the victim in the encounter, and you know, where both are seeking in some ways a certain kind of recognition from the other, you know, gives you a sense of the power of Williams as a writer, and taking something that again was like a formidable trope for 20th century writers and now 21st century writers, and I still think giving us something that's a little bit different. So I'll just read this. This was maybe the last thing I think I have time to say about Williams today. But he is now at the moment of violence, and the officer's name is Procopio and the hero was Eagle. Procopio pulled back, still looking for a sign of fear in the Negro's eyes, but saw instead something that the Negro saw about him. Procopio pushed him and waved the club. Then, with a weariness he had known only hours before with Shirley, and knowing better, much better, Eagle moved, impelled by a gnawing rage, by sad anger at Shirley, a masquerader, and by fury at this man with the sloppy uniform, one of the closers of circles. Eagle stabbed for the club, his hand a huge black claw. His fingers closed about it and he held it motionless. Procopio, attacked by a sudden fear, yanked backwards, wresting the club loose while feeling with a small corner of his mind that the Negro had let him pull backwards. His fear increased. The officer stepped down heavily with his leading foot and smashed the club desperately through the upraised hands. Eagle moved backwards, wide-eyed and open-mouthed. Procopio advanced, beguiled by the clumsy retreating figure, and slashed home with the club. He hesitated the split second of an instant for reaction. It came. The Negro turned fully around. Procopio saw the shoulders moving slowly, ponderously, even amusingly. Procopio started to laugh, but was unable to follow through. Only his forward momentum saved him from going down with the blow the Negro landed on his face. The officer rushed again. The man avoided it, growling from his belly. Another fist crashed against his head. Procopio struck out blindly. He had to. He did not stop until he realized the man was no longer protecting himself, but taking all the blows fully and quivering with the landing of each. Now the officer moved behind Eagle, gripped his collar tightly, and moved him toward a call box. Only then did he see the small knot of students standing a few feet away. "Let's go," Procopio muttered, giving his prisoner an extra shove, which the prisoner accepted limply. Eagle counted their steps, 1, 2, 3. He tested the officer's grip, found it lasting, and gave it up. They stood before the call box. It had taken 5 minutes. And just sort of in that passage, Williams, with an interesting series of transferences so that you can see the officer in some ways encountering a myth, and that you can also see the person who is the victim, the jazz musician, thinking of the relationships with other whites, maybe the people that he's in an intimate relationship. The novel actually is an accounting of the failure of white liberalism in intimate relationships with Black male and female, with sexuality or platonic relationships. But the way that white liberals fail Blacks when they are needed in this encounter with power, but I mean, using the encounter with the police officer and obviously its destructive consequences for the hero. But Williams also was very interested in sort of a straightforward accounting of brutalization in the United States, brutalization and degradation of Black people.
I wanted to raise this idea of roles as I hear you and Mary Helen talking, and I have an eye on how contemporary artists might envision roles for themselves. It seems to me, as I'm listening to you too, that obviously you have critique in the work of both writers, all right, Williams and Marshall, and it's very strong critique of the existing power structure. But from listening to you two, it occurs to me that Marshall was much more the writer activist than, let's say, Williams was, right? And so I'm wondering, as writers think about their roles, for some, the critique in the writing is enough to do, and for others, they see a role for themselves that the writing is only part of it, that they need to write and do other stuff. And I'm wondering if that's a distinction that you see, and that if you would have something to say about that.
That's a good question. Marshall struggled with that all of her life. How much to devote her life to writing, and how much was she obligated to do some kind of activism? Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, she asked Malcolm X what he thought. And he told her that her activism was her writing. So in a way, he gave her a kind of permission to be a writer. I don't think that satisfied her, entirely, because she has that story told over and over again. In Rena, it's how much can I be an activist and still fulfill my duties as a professional artist. I think she ended up doing things like she supported people in the independence movement in Barbados. She definitely spent a lot of money on supporting activists here. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that she did too, that I still haven't been able to corroborate the exact thing that she did, but she withheld part of her taxes during the Vietnam War and put herself in a really precarious position you know, financially and socially, and just refused to pay her taxes during the war. So I know she always kept that activism alive, and you certainly hear and feel it in her work.
Mm-hmm. It's funny because I mean this is great for me because, you know, as I said this morning, you know, I sat in class with her for a year, and all of that was on the back burner. She never,
Always.
none of that ever came out in our class. I was in a class for 2 semesters and I never got that perspective from being in class. I was wondering, Mary Helen, have you found much about her relationship with Sarah Wright, since they were in the same circle, but I don't know of any like direct interaction? Was Paule, was she on the verge of maybe making that trip to Cuba that Sarah Wright made, or?
You know, I think that she might have been. She was on a panel with Sarah Wright in 1966 on the Black woman in literature, and that's the only you know, recollection, the only information I have about that relationship. And I asked Sarah's husband about it, and he couldn't seem to remember anything about Paule. But I want to go back to the police brutality thing, because, you know, Marshall growing up in this very, I don't know, enclosed Barbadian American world as a young girl, doesn't seem to have had those kind of encounters as a young kid. But then, you know, the police brutality thing is probably more of a problem in, you know, in the 60s and beyond. But she does, in Daughters, she does write an incident about police brutality, but it's one that happens to this little 9-year-old boy. And I think it's so interesting because Paule was always a writer whose politics was always on the personal level. So in Daughters, she has, the main character has a good friend named Viney, who has a child by artificial insemination named Robeson, which is very interesting. And Robeson, as a 9-year-old, gets arrested by the police. He's looking in these cars as he on his way home from school. And she describes, you know, this is his mother saying, of course he told them, you know, that he was just looking in the car doors, the car windows. But do you think that cop believed him? All he saw was some Black kid looking in a row of cars when there was nobody around. And right away he thought, little Black kid trying to steal somebody's tape deck to buy drugs. Robeson said he was yelling at him before he even got out of the car, jumping all over him before he could say a word. He tried telling him he wasn't doing anything, that he was on his way from day camp at his school, told him which school, told him he was just playing the game, even tried explaining the game to him. But he said the fool was so busy yelling and calling him a thief, he didn't hear. And it's interesting because here's a little boy that's been brought up to know his rights. And so he's screaming back at the police officer, still gets arrested. And it's a traumatic moment, of course, for his mother to have to go down to the police station and get her child back. So I just think it's interesting that Marshall is aware of the issue of police brutality, but this is where she places it. She places it with this 9-year-old boy named Robeson, which then, you know, suggests all different kinds of things. This is Robeson, the leftist who would have been, you know, fighting against police brutality too. So she's bringing in all of those different threads there.
Mary Helen, doesn't Clive have some kind of an encounter? Doesn't Clive have some kind of an encounter in Brown Girl?
Does he? I can't remember. You might be right.
One point, Keith, to your question, I think that John was one of the organizers of the Black American Academy of Arts and Letters for the 1970 conferences. And I don't know if they had one in 71 or 72, but he did do, you know, that kind of organizational work. And of course, was very committed to some of the people that he knew, like Chester Himes, in helping them with the American publishers. Really spent the organizational part of his career trying to break down barriers in publishing.
But even the Black, man, I get that. But even the Black Academy, that was more armchair, in other words, that the Black Academy of Arts and Letters wasn't a grassroots organization. Is part of what I'm saying.
No, not at all, but did do some celebratory work of Black
Right.
writers,
Right.
which,
That's mainly what they did.
always does
Mhm.
have a particular kind of impact.
Does
Mhm.
this, does this, I don't know, it just strikes me that we don't ask white writers if they are part of some kind of political movement. If they write books, they write books. Is this an additional burden we put on Black intellectuals,
Uh,
Black artists?
I don't know. I think maybe in a leftist tradition, I think they might get asked that. I
Yeah.
mean, you might have asked the Mike Gold that,
Okay.
so but this is part, I think this a part of it, I think, is African too. I think it's part of an African tradition that, your art is one thing, but you always, like, you're expected to do something else. It's
Mhm.
like art in and of itself as your sole enterprise is not very much a traditional African value of what I was always taught, coming through the 60s and
Mhm.
70s. So it is interesting. I mean, I understand your question. Like, we don't ask that question, automatically. But the only reason I asked it was because of her activity,
Right.
not because I was expected of her. If she didn't manifest that, would have been no problem with me at all, But I just asked the question because she actually did that work. Like, she actually did that traveling. She actually got out into those forums, and she got in front of those audiences
Yep.
and spoke those things, right?
Mhm.
So she did take it upon herself to do that, which is what my question
Mhm.
comes from. I'll be the last person to put that burden on a writer. I was just being curious. I'm not a that kind of do this, do that person when it comes to that type of activity. For some people you don't want them around other things you're doing. If they write and write well, you'd be like, great. You'd be on the phone. They say, oh, we having this rally. I'm coming through. You'd be like, no, please don't come down here. Please don't come down here. You're gonna screw, so no, I don't put that burden on everybody. Everybody's not good at everything.
Yeah.
Well, and then the other criticism that we always make is that the people don't write enough. And then,
Yeah.
there are some choices that have to be made. And then sometimes we also make the comment, and this can be an internal comment from the Black community. It can also be an external pressure from outside of the Black community that the quality of the writing isn't satisfactory, or that the writing isn't going far enough. It's not creating enough new audiences. It's not dealing with enough material. The critique isn't sharp enough. That the experimentation with the language isn't intense enough. So, I guess I agree with you, Keith, that we should do good work to remark upon it when it occurs, but maybe it can be very difficult to make that as a criteria.
Was John our most prolific? Well, outside of Frank Yerby and stuff like that, was he the most prolific African American novelist of the 20th century in terms of published novels?
Right. I don't think so, because technically I don't think that he beats Chester, but he does. I want to say you have to help me. I want to say it's about 11 published novels in his lifetime.
I thought it was closer. You see, I thought it was closer to 18 or something like that. So I have to go back and check the count. But I had him.
Looking at one, I got this. There are definitely 15.
Okay.
But it might have been. You said closer to 18.
That's what was in my head. But I have to go back and check. Obviously, I'm getting old, Larry.
But it's remarkable that both of these writers have a huge body of work, and that they, work their entire lives. Paule has 5 novels, 2 books of short stories, the memoir, all kinds of interviews, short pieces that she wrote. But she took a long time to write novels. I mean, sometimes it was 7, 8 years in between, because she agonized over whether or not she was doing good work. As she says, when she went to Grenada to write The Chosen Place of Timeless People, she had tons of research that she had done for that novel. And for the whole 2 years that she was there, she had writer's block. And it was only when she threw away all of this extraneous material that she could actually start working. She realized that she had internalized a lot of that material. She just threw it away, and suddenly the writer's block was gone. that was after 2 years. So, you know, she was a writer, you know, a devoted writer.
See, one of Larry, one of my OGs weighed in the chat room.
Right.
So
Yeah.
Mary Ellen said,
he let us know.
12 novels.
12 novels.
6 nonfiction books, that's 18.
Yeah.
1 book of poetry, 19, and a book of letters. So
and you know, that's the authority on 20th century,
no doubt.
21st century writers is Mary Ellen Graham.
Okay, now there's a topic I feel as though we've been avoiding. And that's the topic of, should we call it gender, or should we call it women? And the way women are portrayed in John A. Williams versus the way women are portrayed in Paule Marshall, or whether way women and men are portrayed in both of them. Is there some critique there, Larry?
Well, I think, you know, why don't you go with it? Because you know, that was why I wanted to read the passage from Sissy, where he does, you know, in 1963, you know, he tries to incorporate or have the sensibility of a woman as the consciousness of his work.
Okay. Well, since, you know, I mean, Paul's major topic is women, and it's not just that the women are central to her work, which they are. There's something else about the way she portrays women. And, you know, there was a man who did a review of her work in the New York Review of Books. And this is the first line in that review. He says, Paule Marshall's women never lose. And I agree with him. They don't ever lose. And it's not that they are always totally successful. I think what I would say is they always have creative potential, and they always have rich interior lives. And I don't think you get that in many male novelists of John A. Williams's generation. Very rarely give you an interior life of women, certainly not the way Paule did. But those rich lives, you know, are lives where you really experience women not just as powerful, but as women who have all kinds of richness within them, and creativity within them, and intellectual ability within them to go through the issues in their lives. So it's not that they always win, it's that she doesn't create losers.
Yeah, I would say, Laura,
be able to like listen to you all like all day.
Are you calling us to the end?
Conversation is all the way live. It is. Thank you so much. But we really want to give some people in the audience an opportunity to ask you all some questions before we end the day. Because the whole gender thing, you know, we can do a whole other conference together. But one of the questions that came up for Dr. Washington, Marshall worked as a librarian for the New York Public Library and served as a distinguished professor and chair of creative writing at New York University. So in your research, have you uncovered writings in Marshall's archive collection reflecting on these positions?
I didn't know that Marshall worked in a library beyond when she was in college. She worked for, you know, she had a couple of part-time jobs. I don't remember any other time that she was a librarian. What was the second part of the question?
And then they also asked, you've made some significant contributions to African American literary scholarship, in which you produced, you know, biographies, John Oliver Killens, Louise Patterson. Do you foresee a resurgence in the literature, activism, and or roles of educators such as luminaries like Marshall's, Williams, Killens, and Patterson in the academy? So do you see a resurgence in that type of writing, you know, coming forward?
You asking me, or was that for?
That's open to the floor.
That's true.
Well, I think this conference is an example of it right now. I mean, there are, over 100 people listening, and being a part of this. So I think that there's an ongoing kind of interest in all of this. And, the more information that gets out there, the more you hear people talk who have been in the archives doing this kind of work, I think the greater the interest is in, this kind of work.
And I see some writers that are speaking out on issues. When I look at I got dragged on the social media, so I go in there sometimes, and I see writers like Kiese writing about and talking about things that are going on, a lot of times locally, things that are going on in Mississippi, or things that are going on at the University of Mississippi. He's commenting, he's weighing in on politics, taking a hard position on some issues, as well as continuing to write. So whether it's a trend, I don't have aggregate data. I can't speak to large trends, but I do see in pockets some writers who also are taking it upon themselves to be voices out in public space as well.
I guess I always maybe can look at the glass half full with this sort of question about who gets remembered and who is forgotten. But in the same way that the question has asked us to think about Killens and Patterson, Marshall, and Williams, there are additional writers who would have missed scrutiny, who are worthy of the same sort of recovery. And the big plea that I would make actually would just be for us to be preservers and custodians of the archive, so that this information that's really incredibly valuable. Keith mentioned earlier the salon where many of the sort of the early Black nationalist ideas are being produced with John Henry Clark and Killens, and Mary Helen has talked about sort of these rich interrelationships that are going on that include people like Paul Marshall and Rosa Gee, and also Malcolm X. But we have to help the next generation of scholars out by making sure that the materials either find their way into a library or find their way into the hands of somebody who is going to make sure that they're preserved and people are given access to these materials. And since we do have 100 people listening, I hope that we can multiply that 100 into 1,000 to get the word out about how valuable it is and how necessary it is to keep track of the different records of Black organizations and Black artistic activity.
Absolutely. Yeah, we were talking this morning about the canon. I was thinking like not as much worried about the canon as worried about getting into the library. So as you're saying, Larry, we can get into those archives and preserve those. That is as important as anything else we could be doing as cultural workers.
The thing I worry about are the Black children in elementary school and high school who are not given access to any of this material, even None. Here in 2021.
None.
I have nephews in high school in Cleveland, a very good high school, and they've never heard of anybody other than, I think they've heard of Ralph Ellison. That's it. And, let me just make a comment about the Me Too movement, because some of the people in the Me Too movement discovered Paul Marshall's story, Brooklyn, because it's about a woman who's being sexually harassed in her college classroom. And they took that on as an important text for them. So, the more we could connect with social media, and I'm not one that does, but the more we could do that, it seems to me that that's one of the places that we are really needed, is out there on Twitter and Instagram and, Facebook. We need to have more of a presence there.
Oh,
sure. Thank you. This is a question that's coming from Sandra Adele. She says,
Hey, Sandra Adele.
Howard University. All right.
In the house. She says, I hate to teach the man who cried I am because of the negative portrayal of women. Any suggestions or strategies?
I'm glad she brought that up.
She said, I hesitate to teach.
Yes, she said hesitate.
Right.
Keith?
She asked you, Mary Helen, but do you want to respond?
No, she didn't ask me. She asked the people who were talking about John A. Williams.
And I think there's a reckoning to be had with that. I mean, there's no way around the analysis that you had a lot of sexist portrayals of women in the literature of a whole generation of writers, and that was part of a number of things. But in the response, it's part of response to their own oppression and degradation or whatever. But there's really no way around that. I don't think you can sugarcoat it. You have to call the sexist and negative portrayals what they are.
Yeah.
And all I can say is that you do have, for example, if I look at a character like Laura Lee Youngblood in Killens' novel Youngblood, we do see a person who is not in that cast in that vein. So I understand the hesitancy, and it is what it is. But I think there's another side of that. I mean, I think that there's negative portrayals of different kinds of people in different kinds of novels, and I won't detail all that. But I'm hesitant about some of those, but I do teach them, and that's another long conversation that takes us into
the Man Who Cried I Am is supposed to be a love tragedy where the hero Max Reddick's wife has died attempting an episode of family planning, and then he transfers. He's supposed to have fallen in love with a woman in Europe who reminds him of Lillian, his lost love. But I think in the same way that we might think of the maybe the value of, say, like the contemporary music or rap culture, right, which has dramatic poles in its representations of men and women that continue to have salience and currency for the contemporary generation, that we could sort of take that approach that we have things that are going to give us reasons, moments for celebration, but then we also have some where we absolutely have to hone our critical skills, and we have to think, is this the sort of world that we want to live in? Is this the desirable world that makes sense for us today? And to use that criticism as we bring in, different, maybe even sections of text, because we're unable even to deal with long text at this point. And so that can help us continue in the recovery of important writers so that they're not sort of excised or, just removed from the canon as if they hadn't existed.
There's a comment question that came up in the chat. It didn't come up in the Q&A. But Malcolm Cash is asking, can you envision a time when Black writers will organize in collective units for political engagement, like the Polish and Russian writers of the 20th century? Do you see a time like that happening for our writers? How would that come about?
People have been trying to do it for a long time. My good friend, the late Luis Reyes Rivera, was always active in trying to establish a writers union, and there are writers unions, but always trying to pump them up. And so, yeah, I can envision it because people have been trying to do it. It's been 2 steps forward and 3 back sometimes, but I can envision it. What it takes is what people have been trying to do. They're trying to identify like interests and multiply, as Larry said earlier, can we make this 100, 1,000, and then can you make that 1,000, 10,000? That's the kind of attitude that you have to have. But it's not that these things have not been attempted. They have been attempted, and in fact are in progress now. We just don't hear a lot about them, which means they haven't gotten as large and aren't as impactful as they need to be.
We certainly want to recognize the work of the phenomenal Sister Brenda Green, in putting us in the place where we are today. I mean, that certainly is like a foundational block of our ability to organize and to communicate as a group.
I was thinking the same thing, that here, right here with the National Black Writers Conference is the closest that I've seen in a long time of bringing together, you know, writers and audiences and activists. It seems to me it would have to be an organization like this.
We got.
Yeah, we have a lot of structures too that you know, we could continue to take advantage of. The sister Barbara Christian said to me years ago that part of the reason why she felt like her generation wasn't as interested in the College Language Association was that it was conservative by the standards of the 1970s and wasn't as welcoming, maybe especially to some of the issues of gender and sexuality right at that point. However, I think that in the 21st century, we certainly have opportunities to use these very long-standing structures that have been pioneered and created for Black Americans, like the College Language Association, and that maybe we could also turn some of our efforts to existing structures.
Okay, well, thank you all so very much. We're coming close to the end of this incredible segment. The information that you've shared, your experiences, your understanding, your scholarship. We're blessed by having you here. So before we go in the last few minutes, I'd just like everybody to you know, have an opportunity to have a closing comment or remark about your own work, about this process, about the two people who we are honoring today. So can we begin with Dr. Jackson?
Well, again, I want to say thank you. It's a pleasure to be involved and to return to the work of John Williams, who again was always a remarkable figure for me because he gave us so much about the life of the publishing writer during the 1950s and 1960s. You know, that was the period for me that I was most interested in. And he, something about the nature of the social environment and the social networks that were available among Black people and across the color line. And I didn't find that in the other writers that I knew about. So I was always really rewarded by these sort of rich treatments of the social world in a writer like John Williams. And as I say, it's an honor to be asked to talk about him. Paule Marshall is also one of my favorite writers, and we didn't get a chance to talk about the way that she embodied for me this process of recovery of the Black past, the African past. And I've always thought Praise Song for the Widow was, you know, one of the most remarkable novels ever written.
Thank you. Dr. Washington.
You know, I want to thank Carol Boyce Davies and Mary Emma Graham for their two talks early this afternoon. Really, really important. And I also want to say that as I'm writing this biography of Paule, that you all have given me invaluable help on what I need to pursue and, you know, what's important and, you know, the holes in the work and what people are interested in. So it's given me a lot of inspiration and encouragement to go back to my work. So thank you for that. You know, I really see this kind of collective as so important for encouraging writers, scholars, teachers, you know. And so, you know, I really want to thank you all for all the work that has gone into producing this conference.
Thank you. And please take us out, Dr. Gilyard.
I just want to thank everybody. It's wonderful to be a part of the event so many years after the first one, 35 years. So I really want to just thank my sister, Dr. Brenda Green, for keeping things going through the years. You know, a lot of us started out on this journey together. We went in different directions, but she's always held the fort right there at Medgar and made the Center for Black Literature something that's viable and important. So I really just want to thank her on the way out and thank everyone who was a part of the event.
We appreciate all of you for being here. Thank you all for everything that you've done for making this part of the afternoon so very special.